Just before we get started, today's podcast talks about sex and sex education, in case you need to be mindful of who you're listening with.
I think it's really hard for parents to talk, or some parents to talk to their children around sex. I mean, I found it hard. Sometimes your kids don't want to listen to you talk about these things. I know I've tried to talk to my kids about it and they just want the ground to swallow them up.
I look at my own background, and my parents brought us clumsily into a room and separated the boys from the girls, and it was very awkward.
I come from the generation where your parents didn't tell you. You only learnt anything from friends, and when I went to school, no teachers told me anything at all either. So I learnt nothing.
Kia ora, I'm Sarah Robson, and today on The Detail, sex education.
When I was at school, which was in the 70s and the 80s, you learned from your mates at school. You know, my father and my mother never told me anything, but these days I think parents take more of a hand in the development of their children.
But what should be left up to parents to teach, and where should and do schools step in?
I think it should be a bit of both. The kids should learn amongst their peers and sit down and just get the basic facts from a health educator who knows what's happening. And also, not all parents, probably, I'd feel that maybe I'm not completely up to date with all the different things that the kids might need to learn.
Our co-host Tom Kitchen takes a closer look at what's being taught in schools about sex and relationships, and asks an expert for advice about how parents can best tackle some of these tricky conversations. First, Tom talks to Dr. Rachel Dixon, a senior lecturer in health from the University of Canterbury. She used to be a high school health teacher before she ventured into academia. They begin by talking about their own experiences of sex education before looking at how it's changed.
I'll tell you what I got out of sex ed. It wasn't much. We called it sex ed back in the day. I left school over a decade ago. It was in health class, I think in year 10. It was taught to us by our PE teacher. These are the highlights, if you can call them that. Well, this is just what I remember. Watching a human reproduction video in year 10 science. I remember seeing a baby being born. And my health teacher saying 1 in 10 people are gay and everyone laughing about it, which is a pretty awful kind of situation to be in, you know. So that was kind of the perception at that time.
Yeah, I mean, you got more health education than I did at school. I was educated at high school in the 1990s. I just remember two one-off sessions, really. One of them was around the condoms, and one of them was around the periods and, you know, the period products getting handed out to the girls. So that's a pretty limited approach to relationships and sexuality ed.
So it's now called RSC, which is Relationships and Sexuality Education.
It's a mouthful. It is. Yeah.
Do you know what it sounds like to me? It sounds like it's religious studies education or something.
It is quite a well-known international term, to be fair. In 2020, the Ministry of Education released their most recent guidance to teachers to kind of support teaching this in the New Zealand curriculum. And this is where they renamed it Relationships and Sexuality Education, because relationships kind of underpin a lot of what we do in this area.
So where does it start at school?
Yeah, I'm going to use the acronym RSE from here on. So learning experiences in RSE do begin from year 1 or level 1 of the curriculum. And at that level, we've got a focus on friendships, relationships with the family, etc. So some basic ideas about being kind and being caring. In those lower levels of the curriculum, children explore body parts and ideas around safe and unsafe touching. We want to give them the language to be able to use if they are in a situation where they do feel unsafe or are subject to some unsafe behaviour. And then consent is a broad term as well, in terms of, the right to say no when it comes to anything to do with your body. No one can touch you unless they say it's okay. Even how to be a good friend in terms of respecting other people, respecting boundaries, that sort of thing. Later on in primary school, there'll be changes to wellbeing at puberty. That comes in, a lot, more discussion of relationships, including potentially the non-platonic type of relationship, and all sorts of ways to keep yourself and others safe in a range of situations. And if we're doing RSE, that's sort of sexuality-related situations. But we also do a lot of work around alcohol and drug type situations. Not so much at primary school. That's something that comes in a bit more in secondary school.
When do you start learning about sex as such?
I think most young people and children would probably learn about that first and foremost in the home. I mean, the Classification Office did some research in 2020 where they found that the majority of the participants in their study had accessed pornography online by the age of 12. Whether they had stumbled across that or deliberately were, seeking that out. So I think our children and young people are learning about sex or, some of these behaviours that they see or hear about online outside of schools and outside of the classroom. So what we want to do in health education and RSE is actually to wrap that educational perspective around it, the criticality, the focus on well-being and, attitudes and values that promote healthy relationships, so that in some ways it's a bit of a balance to the messages that they're getting from everywhere else in this world. I've got a scenario here that might be used in year 10 or 11. So we're talking about 15, 16-year-olds here. My girlfriend sends me nudes of herself without me asking. My mates are jealous. They don't get sent this sort of stuff. So I share her pics with them. She doesn't know I share them. I don't think she would mind, but I'm not going to tell her in case she stops sending them.
That sounds bad.
This is the reality of, young people these days and the nudes. So this here, it was a shortish scenario. So that's something that the groups can get into. So a teacher will have prepared some discussion prompts, and a scenario like that is probably going to be discussed in a small group. Different groups in the class might actually have different scenarios, and then they respond to the prompts, and then they might share their ideas with the wider class, so all of us can sort of get a bit of an insight into what people are thinking.
Any more scenarios you've got there?
Yeah, again, this one you could use in year 10 or 11. A couple has been together for a month and they're talking about having sex. One has had sex before, but the other hasn't. But they say they have because they're embarrassed. So this one here, we need to just be aware that the age of consent in New Zealand is 16. So teachers do need to be mindful of that when they're using these sorts of scenarios, and they'll discuss that as part of the learning, particularly if you are working with that 15, 16-year-old age group there. You might have also noticed that the scenario has not used he and she pronouns. So a discussion point for students may include whether the sex of the couple actually makes any difference. The sorts of prompts I might use with this scenario are: what things might the couple consider before deciding to have sex? Why might the person who hasn't had sex before feel they need to say they have? What impact might this have on the relationship and their well-being overall? And actually this one, there's lots of stuff we can do around this, and that's really fascinating to see what young people think. Would you say this is a healthy or unhealthy relationship? Why or why not?
How prescribed is the curriculum?
So in New Zealand, we have what a lot of people call a framework curriculum. And this may change with the refresh of the curriculum, but at the moment with health and physical education, we're working to the 2007 curriculum. And we've also got the relationships and sexuality education guide from the Ministry of Ed, which does also outline some possible key learning for each level of the curriculum. But it is really important to note that there is no prescribed must-cover content in the curriculum at any particular level here. And it is up to schools to design a local curriculum for health education that meets the needs of their learners and also reflects some of the views of the community in terms of fulfilling the obligations around community consultation for health education.
I wanted to ask you about that. So schools under law have to consult about health education, don't they?
Yes, so health education is a bit of a curiosity in the Education and Training Act. It is the one subject in our schooling system that is sort of specifically mentioned in two different clauses of the Education Act in terms of consulting and the right to withdraw.
So it's the only subject.
It's the only named subject, so it's interesting, but it is an opportunity for schools, boards of trustees, and the teachers who are teaching it to gain some views of the community. It is quite a specific consultation requirement that's in there. It is basically every 2 years, board of trustees needs to consult with the community, which mainly involves the parents of the children at the school, but it may also include other people that they deem to be part of the community. And for a state integrated or a special character school, it might also include the proprietors of the school.
Such as a church.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the diocese or whoever is the governing body there. And it is also important to note the other part of the Act that relates to health education is that parents do have the right to withdraw their children from the sexuality education components of health education.
So when you see the role of parents and teachers, they have two quite distinct roles, don't they, in talking about sex. Do you think there should be are there some things that parents should do at home versus students should be taught at school?
I think the danger in saying that something needs to be taking place in the home and then the school can take care of this other thing is that we do have, we have that range of cultural diversity, and some parents are just not equipped or prepared to have conversations, these open conversations at home. It can be very challenging. It's a very challenging space, but we also just want to make sure that young people and children are not just being educated by what they're seeing online or in social media spaces or what they're hearing about from their peers in the playground, which also might be, it is a common form of misunderstanding and misinformation as well.
I'm actually a firm believer that I think sex education is first and foremost a role of the parent. I think growing up as someone that didn't really get their education from their parents, it was always a shock to me that when friends told me that they did have that happen to them, but I also noticed that they definitely had a much more mature and grounded approach to relationships.
I think schools, I remember my school had an entire day dedicated to sex education, and we had, I think it was 4 or 5 different classes. One, of course, was the mechanics of it all. We had another class on diseases and things like that, but importantly as well, we had a class on consent. I never got it from my parents. I feel as though they're always a bit too awkward for it.
How do you start those conversations? I wouldn't have a bloody clue. So, because I was of that generation where my parents never spoke to me about it, so I didn't even know how to start those conversations.
How should parents approach the topic? Tom spoke to Nick Bates, a clinical psychologist who specialises in relationship and sex therapy.
The birds and the bees. Parents find talking about the birds and the bees with their kids often pretty awkward, don't they?
Well, they do. And I've spent, as a sex therapist, I've spent a good portion of my professional life trying to undo the damage and heal the pain caused by the fact that adults are not having those conversations with their kids. What I find is that the adults aren't even having them with each other. If you can't talk to your partner about sex, then the chances of you being able to talk to your kids are fairly low.
Why do you think it's so hard for us?
Because we have a lot of anxiety about sex and about ourselves and our worth and our attractiveness, and there's a whole parcel.
It's the birds and the bees talk. I remember.
Yeah, which is a really unhelpful way to frame it up.
Why is that?
Because it makes it sound like there should be a single conversation rather than ongoing conversation throughout a whole lifetime. The aim should be to be having a conversation about the broader issues of relationships, sexuality, bodies, consent, all of that stuff. There are aspects of that you can be talking about with your preschooler.
Well, where do we start?
Well, we start with how we relate to our own children. Do we allow them to set boundaries? Do we allow them what's formerly known as bodily autonomy, so the right to be in control of their body? So the classic example is forcing a young child to kiss or hug somebody that they don't know very well. And if you force your child to do that, you're teaching them, you don't get to set boundaries. Other people are allowed to impose themselves on you physically. That's not good learning for later understanding about consent.
How old would a child be when you would start those conversations?
As soon as they're old enough to kind of go to show a preference for not touching somebody or not hugging somebody, or so probably before they can walk. Because, I mean, why are you forcing it? It's usually about social embarrassment. So, your concern about the aunt or the uncle taking offense is more important than the kid learning, they actually can be in control of their own bodies.
And where can you go from there?
You keep having those conversations. I mean, kids are curious about their own bodies. Teach them about them. I was just discussing this interview with my partner Verity, who's also a relationship and sex therapist, and she was reminding me that our son asked at 4, how does the sperm get to the egg? He'd had enough education that he knew that there was a sperm and an egg, and she just told him, the penis goes into the vagina, and then the sperm comes out, and it wiggles its way up a tube to get to the egg. Now that was the end of the conversation. But our friends were shocked that she'd been so explicit. But it's like, well, he wanted a question. We gave him a factual answer. That was the end of the conversation.
I don't remember having those conversations with my parents until I was at least 12 or 13.
I think the other thing, the reason why ideally parents should be doing this work rather than outsourcing it to schools is that each child is different. And what they're curious about is different. And what they're curious about at different ages is different. And so trying to, adopt a one-size-fits-all approach for kids is not going to give kids the best option. So it's about, relating to your kid and what they're interested in and what they want to know about and what they're ready for. Our daughter was really interested in the nitty-gritty and the nuts and bolts and about relationships and sexual relationships and sex and all that at a very early age, and our son wasn't.
But is there a particular time where you should teach your children about some of these key aspects?
I mean, if they start showing interest in dating or in being attracted to somebody else and showing interest in sex, I mean, then that's a time to talk about that. But there are things like, ideally you watch a TV program or a movie with your kid. And most, a lot of TV and a lot of movies will have something about relationships. Action hero movies still have relationships in them. And you can chat about those things. Oh, he went ahead and did that without asking. What do you think about that? You reckon that was fair?
Yeah, so you can start younger talking about relationships and how to have a good relationship.
Absolutely.
And maybe you move that on to a wider conversation about what sex is.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that when your kids start showing interest in sex, the thing is you need to have an open enough and honest enough relationship with them that they are willing to signal that to you. Maybe not explicitly tell you, but, where you can track it and go, and then you can talk to them about it at that point. But that point is going to be really, really different for different kids.
Are there some things that you think should be taught in schools versus being taught by parents?
Parents modelling having those intimate conversations, I think, is irreplaceable. However, I think kids being given accurate information about how sex works, and in terms of things like attraction and arousal and gender differences, but also individual differences.
So some of those conversations should be at school?
Well, I think, yes, they should be a part of the sex ed curriculum, so that, people who aren't having that at home at least getting some of that information.
But yeah, the other difficult thing is, you want to have some consistency, don't you? You're going to get some consistency at school versus the parents. Parents have different values, come from different backgrounds, so they might learn completely different things or not learn things at all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I think in practice, I think it is really important that we have a robust sex education curriculum within schools. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but I think it should be a backstop. There is quite a lot that we know that is useful and significant, and it can be taught and I mean there are some really good models out there for good sex ed and sex and relationship ed, and I really hope that some of them are getting into the schools now.
Okay, well, look, thank you, Nick. Really appreciate it. I mean, yeah, just to summarise, if parents come to the end of this podcast, they're a little bit like, that was a lot of information, a bit overwhelming. I need a few steps, What can they do?
Well, I think, treat relationships, treat, sex as just part of life. Hopefully, you'll talk to your kids about death and illness as well. These are all part of life, and they're not necessarily easy things to talk about. They're not necessarily comfortable things to talk about. But intimacy, real intimacy, real sharing at a deep level is often uncomfortable, is often anxiety provoking. And so the modeling to your children of, we can talk about difficult subjects. We're allowed to be anxious. We're allowed to feel awkward, and we can still have the conversation. And if modeling that is so valuable and so useful.
That's it for today. I'm Sarah Robson. The Detail is supported by the Public Interest Journalism Fund. Today's episode was engineered by William Saunders. It was produced by me, Bonnie Harrison and Mark Jennings. And thanks to Rachel Dixon, Nick Bates and everyone else who talked to us about sex. Ka kite anō.